I won't embarrass Mufti Abdur-Rahman too much by going into his bio. You all have his bio. I will simply say that he's someone I've known for several years, who's really, mashallah, very well accomplished in different arenas. As a Mufti in his own tradition, but also as an academic with a doctorate from SOAS in Islamic Studies, and somebody who, mashallah, takes a very wide angle kind of lens on certain issues, and a just thoroughly enjoyable human being. Today we're going to listen to him for about 20-25 minutes, at which point we'll open up the floor for questions, inshallah. Bismillah. Shukr.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fih mubarakan alayh kama yuhibbu rabbuna wa yarda jalla jalaluhu wa amma nawaluh wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil habibil mustafa sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa baraka wa sallama tasliman kathiran ila yawmiddin. أما بعد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد بل هو آيات بينات في صدور الذين أوتوا العلم صدق الله العظيم. So respected attendees, alhamdulillah, we're coming to a close on this. My talk today is more about the effect of the Indian subcontinent and the devotional practices of the subcontinent pretty much throughout the world. And the reason I say this is because I say this like both as I don't know if I can actually call myself an insider. I'm definitely an outsider. I have an overseas citizenship of India. So seeing how devotional practice in India have pretty much affected nearly all the countries in the West. So I think that's what my paper is going to be about, and I've actually chosen somebody very specific. If I'm going to start this paper, if I start it with a question that which Indian personality, religious personality, comes to your mind as being the most influential on the devotional practices of the subcontinent? A number of personalities could come to mind. We had a discussion about Sheikh Mu'inuddin Chishti rahimahullah earlier. And there's a number of others that will come to mind as well. So today, the person I want to speak about is somebody that very few scholars from the Indian subcontinent and beyond today who have probably not in some way or the other benefited from the heritage of that person's heritage. And that's Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi. Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi, known by a number of other names. His story goes back centuries. He didn't just appear in a vacuum. There was a lot done in the subcontinent for Sheikh Imam Ahmed Sarhindi to have flourished the way he did, and then to do the work that he did, and then to be given the title as reviver of the second millennium. So I just want to discuss some of that in this paper. So Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi is born in 971, died in 1034 Hijri. So that's just the end and beginning of the Islamic second millennium. Just to put it in perspective, from a Gregorian perspective, that's 1624, 1564 to 1624. His story goes back centuries. It didn't just start, that's 400 years ago when he lived. It didn't just start then, in 971 of the Hijrah. It actually starts with the spread of Islam in the Indian subcontinent by Muslims from Arabia, Muhammad bin Qasim in Sindh, and then in other places of the rest of the subcontinent. And I would probably assume that a number of you sitting here today would probably take pride in referring to themselves as Siddiqi, right? Any Siddiqis here? No Siddiqis? Okay, Usmani. Right, you've got a claim to Siddiqi, being Siddiqi, Faruqi, Uthmani, Alawi, and then of course we definitely have some Sayyids here, and MashaAllah, Mawlana Mahmoud Madni Sayyid. So obviously they all trace their ancestry to some of the greatest forebears of Islam that go beyond the Indian subcontinent. However, I have to add this, we can't guarantee that all such attributions can be reliably traced. For as with anything that is valuable, there's always going to be fakes that appear. Right? So, among the descendants of these Uthmanis and Siddiqis and others that came into the subcontinent, there was a family that ended up in Punjab. Now I know we've got a few Punjabis here and I really want to highlight this point because this is really amazing, right? I wish there were more Punjabis here so that they could really... Aftab, you're from Punjab? Yeah? And Zishan? Punjabi? MashaAllah. Right? So, now Punjab is actually divided between India and Pakistan, but the area that I speak about is actually on the Indian side, which is called Sarhind. I've had MashaAllah, the honor to have visited. Many of these and surrounding areas had large Muslim populations before 1946, but unfortunately, after the problems, many of them have migrated to Pakistan and beyond. There's always a silver lining to everything. And MashaAllah, we have a huge population of Punjabis in the UK. So, I want to speak about 3 events now, and then we're going to tie those 3 events together. The first event is that in Sarhind settled a family of the Farooqi line. So out of these 4 or 5 famous families, a Farooqi line, descendants of Umar al-Faruq, Amir al-Mu'mineen, radiyallahu anhu, Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiyallahu anhu, settled there. One of the scholars of this, his son's name was Ahmed. He was the one who eventually becomes Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi, but how does he do that? So, much before this time, we have to start some centuries before that in Uzbekistan, which is not too far away, right? It's just Afghanistan and then there's Uzbekistan just beyond the Oxus River. In the lands of Bukhara, Samarkand, Tirmidh, Khawarizm, Shash, Tashkent, Nasaf, etc. There's a scholar from Bukhara in particular, Bahauddin Naqshband, died in 1389 Hijri. It worked very hard to establish an order, actually not 1389, it was 1389 Gregorian. Worked very hard to establish an order of spirituality to connect people to Allah Most High. This order eventually became known as the Naqshbandi order. He had many students and disciples who spread around and inspired many of the subsequent generations. One of the spiritual descendants further down the line was a Khaja called Khaja Muhammad Amkanagi. He died in 1600 Gregorian. Khaja Muhammad Amkanagi. Now, in the time of this Khaja Muhammad Amkanagi, in around just before the 1600s, there's a third individual now. He leaves Kabul. Now, Kabul is next door in Afghanistan today, and he's looking for spiritual purification, enlightenment, fulfillment. His name is Radiuddin Muhammad Baqi. Eventually he becomes known as Khaja Baqi Billah. Now he's seeking to develop closeness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so he goes to one khanqa, one spiritual lodge to another, until he eventually ends up over the border. I don't know if there was a border, it was called Khurasan maybe at that time, I'm not sure, into Uzbekistan. And Shaykh al-Akbar, Ibn Arabi rahimahullah had just departed before this, and Ghazali rahimahullah departed before that, and mashallah, there were spiritual lodges everywhere, people were interested in tasawwuf. However, there's also a lot of corruption that had crept into the field of tasawwuf as it happens to everything, if things aren't managed properly over time, due to exaggerations, misunderstandings of certain Sufi concepts. A level of laxity, in fact, had even crept in to certain Sufi groups. And there's also discussion of some who even started treating tasawwuf and Sufism as a totally separate religion altogether. And therefore, they thought it was okay to neglect some of the fundamental practices of Islam like salat and so on, as long as you are a Sufi. Now this, going back to Khaja Baqi Billah, he's moving from Khanqa to Khanqa, and suddenly he ends up in the spiritual retreat of this Khaja Amkanagi that I just spoke about in Uzbekistan. He stays with him and he finds fulfillment down there, and this Khaja Amkanagi gives him the Khilafah, right? He bestows him with the mantle of Khilafah, and he authorizes him to teach others tasawwuf. While Khaja Baqi Billah is there, he sees a dream in which he sees a parrot. There has to be a dream somewhere in this. Okay, dreams are, mashallah, very important. He sees a parrot. Now, what's significant about a parrot in those days, I don't think anymore, but in those days, parrots were seen as a Hindustani, an Indian bird, right? I've still not worked out why, because I don't think that's where they started, but they were seen as Indian birds. And this dream was interpreted that Khaja Baqi Billah had to go to the subcontinent. And the Shaykh Khaja Baqi Billah, he was reluctant to go. He was a very low-key figure, very humble person, probably an introvert. But he was instructed by his Shaykh to go to India. And he was told that when you go to India, you will find a man there to whom you will have to pass on your teachings. You'll have to pass on your teachings. That man, in turn, is going to become instrumental in the preservation of the religion in India and the defense of it, a major defense of the religion in India, and you're going to be the means towards that. So reluctantly, he traveled to India and he settles in a masjid in Delhi. I've been to this masjid. I think he's buried behind there. And at that time, Delhi was one of the great cities of the world. I'm not sure if it still is or not, but at that time it was definitely one of the great cities of Delhi. I'll leave the rest to you to decide about today. And very soon people were drawn towards him. As every sincere friend and lover of Allah, they become like magnets. And many, many people flocked to him, and they found benefit in his discourses and his company. And the reason for that is simply a hadith tells us, a prophetic narration tells us that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves somebody, He calls Jibreel alayhi salam and he says, I love such and such a person, so you should love him too. And Jibreel alayhi salam then pretty much just spreads this information among the other angels, and then the angels come onto the earth, and that message becomes spread subliminally, or whatever the wavelength it's on, through the human beings and people. There's an acceptance. فَيُوضَعُ لَهُ الْقَبُولُ فِي الْأَرْضِ. An acceptance is placed for them in their hearts. Now, let's go back to Sirhind. We're in Delhi now. Allahu Akbar. And we go back to Sirhind. He was Imam Ahmed, Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi. He was on his way for Hajj, and he'd heard about this Khaja Baqi Billah, and he decided to visit him. Now, Sheikh Ahmed had already studied tasawwuf under his father. He was a great alim already, proficient scholar of the Sharia, well grounded in both theology, jurisprudence, and all the various different sciences. He arrived in Delhi, and he went to meet Khaja Baqi Billah and ends up staying with him for a few months. And then he visits him once or twice more thereafter. On that last visit, Khaja Baqi Billah, maybe before this, Khaja Baqi Billah realizes that this is the man from India that he has been told to pass his transmission on to. So in his last visit, he says to all of his students that from now on, you're going to take your knowledge from Sheikh Ahmed, and eventually Khaja Baqi Billah passes away. Sheikh Ahmed doesn't stay in Delhi. He goes back to Sirhind and he continues his work, and he becomes very, very well known. Now, at this time, there's a major problem that has gripped the subcontinent. Now, you have to remember, subcontinent has been very powerful from before. If you look in the Hijaz, in Arabia, the subcontinent people have had a major influence there from centuries before, in terms of lodges and a number of things. In fact, the Hajj camps of the Indians was probably the closest before. I think now they've kind of shifted them, but they had a lot of influence there, right? And in many other places, because they were traders and other things in Malaysia, in lots of other places. Now, at this time, it's the third Mughal emperor, the third Mughal ruler, whose name is Akbar, son of Humayun, grandson of Babur. He originally says he started his life as a righteous kind of person. He had a lot of respect for ulama at the beginning as well. And it looks like because there was some chaos during his young age, he didn't learn to read and write, maybe. So that's why he was very impressionable. And there were a number of corrupt people giving him misleading advice, if we want to blame it on the advisors. Hindustan has probably always been a majority Hindu country, right? Even though we have 200 million Muslims there right now, it's still a majority Hindu country. And Akbar became obsessed with the idea to unite all the religions in one. And that's something every Indian will know about, every Indian Muslim will know about. So he enacted a number of laws in this regard. For instance, the slaughtering of cows was forbidden at that time. And he called this religion Deen-e Ilahi, or the Akbari religion, Deen-e Akbari, various names are given. He imposed a number of other strange practices. For instance, anybody who visited him had to do what they call a sajdatut ta'zeem or sajda ta'zeemi, right, a prostration of reverence. And he even found scholars to justify it, saying that it's not shirk as long as they're not doing it for ibadah and worship purposes. There were a number of scholars at that time who spoke out against this. But this was going to have major impact, because the people of Subcontinent, if we look at it in hindsight, I don't know if they would have understood this then or seen how significant this point was going to be. Because right now we have the Subcontinent people in multitude of countries. And imagine if this particular religion was allowed to have continued. So what we have to understand is that the Sunnah of Allah is never to neglect the Muslim community. The Muslim world has faced many ups and downs, highs and lows, ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys, waxing and waning, fluctuations and good and bad times. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has always revived the Muslims, as has been shown wonderfully by Sheikh Abul Hasan Nadwi in his Saviors of Islamic Study, Tariq Da'wat wa Azimat, which I think at this time people should really read, right? It really gives you a lot of inspiration. Eventually Akbar died after having instituted all of these so-called reforms of his. And then his son Jahangir became the next ruler of India. He was a much nicer man in the sense, not as ideologically stubborn or driven as his father. He was more interested in probably the luxuries of life, right? I mean, we are talking about people of the past. We learned this from the historians. Now, what it is that if there's a person who's an ideologue against Islam, it's much more difficult to convince them because they have an ideology. Anybody who's not an ideologue, who's just more interested in enjoyment and so on, they still have a heart, and you can get to their heart, and it's easier to influence such people. Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi eventually has a meeting with Jahangir, and some meetings. What happens is his fame continues to grow, and people around Jahangir tell him that you better be warned about this man because he could be your destruction, it could be a problem for you. So Jahangir reckoned that Imam Sarhindi was a threat, so he imprisoned him for about a year. For Sheikh Ahmed, mashallah, a person of Allah, he made that his khanqah. The prison became his spiritual lodge, and many of the prisoners became religious and recanted their own ways. Jahangir eventually regretted what he had done. He took him out of prison, but then he put him in kind of a house arrest that he had to stay with him. You're like my personal advisor. And he became really, really drawn to him, such that eventually when Sheikh Ahmed passed away, Jahangir even thought that he was his Khalifa. His other Khulafa had to actually say, no, you are very close to him, but you are not his Khalifa. He managed to get Jahangir to reverse a lot of the corrupt laws that his father had enacted, so that finally the ban on cow slaughter was lifted, and many religious prisoners were freed. Now, just to hurry up now, after the death of Sheikh Ahmed, his son Khaja Ma'soom, he took over, he continued his father's work with working with this royal family, with the Mughals. After him, his son Khaja Saifuddin, who died in 1096, he worked on the family, because it was very important that this family be kept secure because they were very powerful at the time. And the Mughals were powerful until eventually Aurangzeb, after which they started to decline, and then there was a decline afterwards. The Mughals have left an indelible mark on the subcontinent, and I would say beyond, through the people who've moved to the other places. You could probably say that Aurangzeb, who probably became one of the most, arguably maybe one of the greatest and most powerful of their rulers, unfortunately after that it began to wane. I mean, I see a parallel between him and Sheikh Abdul Hamid, or Sultan Abdul Hamid of the Ottoman Empire, the last of the great rulers of the Ottomans, and then after that things just totally descended into towards basically eventually a destruction of the whole state. Now Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi is referred to by many names. One is Imam Rabbani, and the other one more famous is Mujaddid al-Thani, reviver of the second millennium. There's many people throughout history who've been noted for being revivers of each century, 100 years, as the hadith in Sunan Abu Dawud tells us that there will be such a person. But something unique about Sheikh Ahmed is that he's considered the reviver of the second millennium. Now, there are people who've questioned this title, that is he really a reviver? I mean, at least a reviver of the second millennium or not? Now, I would probably say that because the subcontinent has always held a very important position, and more so in the last 100, 200 years, is been influential. People of the subcontinent have been influential in many parts of the Muslim world, Hijaz, the Malay archipelago, and in more recent times, many countries of Africa. I've traveled to at least 5 or 6 countries of Africa, and mashallah, there's a presence of Indians, Pakistani, Bangladeshis there, primarily Indians. And then pretty much the most of the Western world, America, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and many parts of Europe, right? And they're doing some solid work. I mean, this is all an effect of this. So the scene would have been very different if the Deen-e-Ilahi had been allowed to prosper and had not been reined in. And we can say it was Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi's work and efforts that managed to put this down. Another area, a few more areas, another area Sheikh Ahmed plays a very pivotal role is removing a lot of the corruptions that had entered and plagued Sufism over time, right? One of them was the concept of Wahdatul Wujud. Now, nothing necessarily wrong with Wahdatul Wujud, and I don't want to get into that, but at that time, it says that maybe 90% of the Sufis of the world were proponents of Wahdatul Wujud, and some in a very extreme way, to such a degree that they left praying Salat because Wahdatul Wujud somehow justified for them that being one with Allah didn't need you to do any other worship, and so on. Now, there were many people who wrote against and spoke against the concept, this extreme idea that had come up, but they wouldn't be listened to. They would just be passed off as people of the Zahir, people of the apparent. That's why what you needed is you needed a proficient Sufi master, right? Who, couldn't be sidelined, who couldn't be dismissed. And that is where Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi comes in. He repudiated this concept, put forward a modified version, which he termed Wahdatul Shuhud, arguing it to be the more sounder one, a less problematic one. Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi has written a number of works. I can't go into all of that. Many of them are actually epistles and letters, the maktubat. And subhanAllah, if you go to, for example, Turkey today, and if you're a teacher of the maktubat in Turkey, right, the whole of Turkey, then you are just like the teacher of Sahih al-Bukhari is revered, right? You get that kind of reverence. It could also be argued that the religiosity in Turkey, right, especially since the 60-year, 70-year secularization program that was initiated after the 1924, the breaking down of the Ottoman Empire, where where adhan was banned in Arabic and they had to do it in Turkish and so on and so forth. He's had a massive impact there. In fact, Sheikh Badi'uz-Zaman Sa'id Nursi died in 1960. He's had a massive impact. And it could be said that Sheikh Badi'uz-Zaman Sa'id Nursi has a massive influence of Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi. If you go back to the subcontinent, and it's not just there, it's in Iraq. Alusi, there's Sheikh Khalid Naqshbandi, who came and became a student of one of the grand descendants of Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi, and then he went and he spread this Naqshbandiya in Syria. Imam Ibn Abidin, the famous jurist, he was of that tariq, Imam Alusi, and a number of others. Now, going back to the subcontinent, Shah Waliullah and his sons, and their whole enterprise may have not been possible had it not been for the devotional work and foundations laid down by Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi earlier, right? Then, if it were not for the Shah Waliullah family, then there may have not been a Sheikh Ahmed Shaheed and his movement and his reform movement. And had it not been for Sheikh Ahmed Shaheed, there may have not been a Haji Imdadullah, followed by the likes of Sheikh Qasim Nanotwi, Rashid Ahmed Gangohi, Hakim Ulumma, Mawlana Shabli Thanwi, Muhammad Ilyas Kandilwi, and thus there may have not been a Darul Uloom Deoband, nor a Tablighi Jamaat, and many other movements. So the reform movements didn't just start in Deoband in 1867. It started well before that. You can trace it all the way up to Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi and before that. Mu'inuddin Chishti and above and above and above, all the way obviously to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi is responsible for a number of other things, like reviving the Naqshbandi Tariq from 17 lessons to 35 lessons and so on. Now, just to finish off in the 2 minutes, how far has this reached and where has this gone? I say Sheikh Ahmad would never have had this in his mind, of where in 400 years his teaching could have reached. So today, the teachings inspired by Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi and others obviously are found in most of the Western world, in Europe, Americas, Africa, Australia, Asia. For example, in Indonesia, a large madrasa there with 12,000 students in a place called Temboro teaches the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi path that was inspired by Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi. Likewise, what a small place in Punjab called Sarhind in India, right? Have you ever heard of Sarhind? Yeah? Okay. Has produced waves of piety, not only around the subcontinent, but also beyond, in places to where its inhabitants migrated and set up seminaries, such as Bury, UK, Buffalo, USA, and also to lands from where individuals came to the subcontinent to drink from its fountains of religious devotion and divine knowledge. So, that's a short excursion. May the legacy of devotion of the subcontinent continue on. As we move on, we have many more countries to get to, and may it continue. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much for a very informative paper, and thank you for keeping to time. I'm going to throw this open to the floor. Before I do, I'll take the prerogative of the chair. You addressed it partially, but I'm wondering if I can press you just a little bit on it, which is in terms of Shaykh Ahmed Sarhindi's impact and effect far beyond India. So you did mention certain geographical spaces like Turkey and Iraq, and of course where Indians migrated elsewhere. But you also linked this primarily, although not exclusively, because Badi al-Zaman Nursi wasn't the Naqshbandi of his line. He may well have been of another line, but not of that line. You linked mostly his impact to followers of his tariqah. Were there... I'm sorry?
Followers of whose tariqah?
Of his tariqah. Of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi tariqah line, which of course goes through him. Were there any other impacts on the Islamic sciences more generally in terms of how they were taught or practiced or so on elsewhere that existed outside of inheritors or murids of his tariqah?
No, I don't think we can exclusively relate everything back to him. He just plays a major part in dismantling the Deen Ilahi, and then after that setting up the reform work of purifying the corruptions in Tasawwuf coming from a Sufi. So I think what he does is he lays down a foundation. That obviously gives, mashallah, see, because I think for 200 centuries from Sheikh Mu'inuddin Chishti, rahimahullah's time, for 200 centuries you had the ascendancy of the Chishtis throughout the subcontinent. And after, I think it was after the fifth one, I forget his name. After that, it was the ascendancy of the Naqshbandis, and that lasted for about 3 to 4 centuries. And then after that, with Haji Imdadullah, it looks like he was initially with a Naqshbandi Sheikh who passed away, and then after that he moved to a Chishti Sheikh, and thereafter that the Chishtiya was enlivened again. And right now we're seeing, that's what we're seeing. So no, it's not exclusively him, for sure.
Okay, if you could raise your hand and I will come to you in order. So we'll go here and then there, inshallah, and then there, okay. Bismillah.
Yeah, thank you very much for an excellent talk. I'm saying talk because I couldn't get your paper, so I couldn't read it. Yeah, I didn't have. Anyway, it's an excellent paper, and there are two ways to read this paper. One is the way you are describing the personality and the historical context in which Ahmed Sarhindi lived and worked. The other way is that what is the takeaway of this, and shall we put it in a different perspective to draw different meanings of this paper? And I'm interested in the later part of it, because you are in a way, very interestingly, pointing towards a contest between the religious discourses as well as political power. And this is very significant because whenever we think of idea of heritage in subcontinent and especially in post-colonial India, it is very important for us as Indian Muslims that what could be the important component of the medieval times which should be commemorated in a positive way. And your talk, the ways in which you are linking Ahmad Sarhindi with Shah Waliullah, and later, for instance, Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, I think that it provides a different idea of heritage, in which we can assert that a dividing line was always drawn between political power and the religious assertion. So the devotional assertion was, in a way, to use a very complicated term, secular, was always there, that you can accommodate different people without giving up your essential Islamicness, in a way that you would always remain Islamic, but at the same time you would open up, and at the same time you would also assert yourself against the established political power. So if that is the case, then there is a strong possibility to think of this idea of heritage, which makes us more Islamic, more open in comparison to Muslim rule. So if we look at the blame game that is played out in contemporary India, that Muslims are treated as if whatsoever done by the Muslim rulers in medieval India, the contemporary Muslim communities are responsible for that. If I take from you this important reformulation of the idea of heritage, then we can certainly find an answer. No, we are not responsible what Akbar did or what Aurangzeb did. We can certainly say that being an Islamic, being a Muslim as well as practicing Islamic communities, we have a different notion of heritage, and this notion of heritage is still surviving. So I think that's the most important takeaway, at least for me. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Again, because I'm not so aware of the exact dynamics in India right now, but that's a really interesting point, that it's always been, our devotion has always been the most important, because that's the powerhouse, that's the heart. That's what keeps our faith. Siyasa and politics is something that has to be adjusted and adapted to what the need is of that time. And despite being, on this path of devotion, it doesn't stop you, as Sheikh Hussain Ahmad Madni's legacy shows us, of being part of the politics. So alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair for that.
Please, go ahead.
My question is more in the form of a clarification. This is certainly not my domain of knowledge, so there are too many names.
Don't worry, it's not mine as well, so it's okay. Yeah.
So what I understand out of this is this. So there is this gentleman who has been able to revive a tradition, right, and which has now global influence, right? So that's the basic argument. Now the question is this, that that he's also the guy who brainwashed Jahangir, Akbar's son, about Din-e-Ilahi.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd agree with brainwashed, but
if I ask this question, what led to the end of Din-e-Ilahi? For instance, what caused the end of Din-e-Ilahi, the entire project? Because Akbar basically wanted to be a prophet, right?
How did
it end? It's his son who basically disregarded everything that his father had done. Someone must have convinced him, or on his own he has convinced him. Yeah, okay. So Jahangir, yeah. So obviously revival comes in the context of there was some decline that had happened, and there is somebody who's trying to revive a tradition about it. So now the question is this, that and which I think, in my understanding, it's probably a weak link, and I'm interested if you could shed some light on that, which is, if I suggest that the global success of whatever evidence that we see outside the continent is less about the merit of this particular tradition, more about the entrepreneurial ability of his followers, will that be a good argument?
The interpretive ability, you said?
Entrepreneurial,
yes, that, to a certain degree, that's definitely the case. As a vehicle for this. I think my point was that, I mean, it's not because of his teachings that people spread around the world. That's just an Indian thing. That's just Indian entrepreneurs, going around the world. But had it not been for his work, we could have said there would have been a different scene wherever they did go. They probably would have still gone, but it may have been a totally different scene.
Okay, we still have time for several more questions, so I have one here, and then here. Any others to be put down? No? Okay, Bismillah.
MashaAllah, excellent talk. One of the underlying aspects, or rather the methodology adopted by this great sheikh, was a long-term strategy, or rather the way he envisioned the change that has to be made in that particular society. It wasn't as if just to pass a fatwa, okay, this is not done. He was someone who visioned something which bear fruit 3 generations down the line, 4 generations down the line. So I have a rather concern, or masquerading as a question perhaps, that in the present times, the present ulama, the scholarship that we have, more particularly in the institutional setup, what kind, are we really following such kind of things, or drawing inspiration from such long-term vision kind of thing, like, okay, fine, this is not happening according to Islam? So that's one part. And the second question, which is linked or indirectly, is that each generation or each century or perhaps centuries have a language which is there. For instance, Persian was once the language of the elites. Arguably, English is the language of the elites in the past few centuries, or perhaps for the next few.
And maybe Chinese next, yes. Okay.
So, sorry?
Maybe Chinese next.
You never know. But at present, in general, in India or increasingly across the world, anyone who is being considered to be educated is well versed with English. So the present elites, so-called elites, people who are in the government or the know-how or in the policy making, or people who are really thinkers, they are actually cut off with such kind of scholarship and work.
I appreciate that.
So what do you suggest, or what are the steps that you suggest? I mean, I'm just concerned that we can do for that.
So firstly, I doubt that Sheikh Ahmad Sarhindi was, wallahu alam, I doubt he was ever told that what's your 5-year plan, your 10-year plan, and your 20-year plan. I would doubt that he would have. It may have been, I think what he probably saw was the corruption, and this is those people Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to take, except for his service like that. They have that natural vision, right? That this is corrupt, this is going in the wrong direction. If I don't see this as my responsibility, then I'm in trouble. You have to see it as your responsibility, you have to have the capability, the proficiency, and a number of other things. And that all came together in Sheikh Ahmad Sarhindi, I think. So that's what I would think, and I don't think we disagree there anyway. In terms of the vision, I think what you're talking about is lughatul qawm, right? Lughatul qawm. That is extremely important, is that we are able to converse in the dominant qawm, the dominant people who are setting the trends. So as you highlighted, English probably is the language, is the lingua franca of the qawm as such. And for that to happen, in England, alhamdulillah, I mean, we're in the West, we're native speakers, so all the ulama that graduate there, they speak English, but unfortunately they could do much better, and there's always an emphasis that heighten your language. Because in Urdu, there is a slang, but most people who are educated, they speak a decent form of eloquent Urdu, right? Whereas in English, we have a problem, even in English-speaking countries, that a lot of our ulama may just be speaking a slang, or colloquial at least, form of language. So our constant, like in our madrasa, this is what we're constantly pushing them to do, that you need to learn the lughatul qawm. When somebody listens to you, they can't tell the difference. They are amazed by what you say, because language is a carrier and it's a vehicle, and that's very important. So we need a lot more. But in India, I've seen this, that when I go to Bangalore, for example, out of the 4 million Muslims there, 1 million speak English. I've even gone there and told them off, but I think I'm wasting my time. When I've gone to Pakistan, I insist on speaking Urdu, but they say, no, speak English, otherwise nobody's going to listen to you. So there's a massive problem in India, subcontinent, and Pakistan, that if the ulama don't start conversing in Urdu, then we're going to lose people. We're already losing people.
So I'm concerned, translations and all,
Sorry?
I'm concerned, or rather, such great works, they are just for people who know good Urdu, in fact.
Yeah.
They're not open for us, like the common people who don't know.
No, in that front, alhamdulillah, a number of books are being translated into English. Where's Yahya? Yahya Bhai is there. White Thread and Turath Publishing, we've published a number of translated books in good quality language that anybody will pick up and inshallah be able to. And now for the Indian market, because the Indian market, you can't pay £10 for a book, right? That's 1,000 rupees.
Yeah.
No, it's yeah.
I think
So now we've actually having select books published in India in English through Ilm Store. I'll just plug it right now. Ilmstore.in, is it India.in? And they're actually publishing there. You have some good printing presses. So inshallah that will become more, but we need to do a lot more work.
MashaAllah, you just need to market that well. Yeah. It's very much needed. General perception across the board is that whatever is it, Islamic or such works are something of 1400 years old. And unless that is given in the language that we understand, the modern language, it's a challenge. MashaAllah, very good.
Jazakallah khair.
Okay, this will be our final question, which I'll have to ask you to make it brief as we need to move on to the closing session.
No question, but I just want to suggest 2-3 things. Deen Ilahi was not a very challengeable religion started by Akbar. It died its natural death within Akbar's time. Hardly a few numbers of the people were, to please the emperor, accepted it. And it is very interesting to note that once Akbar told Raja Man Singh, a Hindu, to adopt this Deen Ilahi, he said, Shahanshah, I know only Hinduism and Islam. If you say I become a Muslim, but I don't know the Deen Ilahi. So, but there were some evils in the society. For that, Shaykh Ahmad Sarandji took the task. His relation with the Chishtis, his father was a Chishti, and 2 important things from his life have been recorded. And I think that you must have gone to Friedman Yaunna's book on Shaykh Ahmad Sarandji. Friedman Yaunna's book. Very interesting and very in detail.
What's his name?
Yaunna, Friedman. I will give the name.
Okay, I'll take it from you. Yeah.
Shaykh Ahmad Sarandji, when visited the Ajmer shrine, he was offered a chadar cloth sheet from the shrine's people, and he took it with all respect, in spite of all his Puritan thought and beliefs, and told the people that this will be beneficial for me in the other world. So please bury it with me. But it could not be possible at the time of death. So you must also highlight some relation of Shaykh Ahmad Sarandji, and more importantly, he appointed his son on Qayyumiyat at Ajmer.
As well?
Qayyumiyat, the concept of Qayyumiyat. Okay. I think you now touched it. Qayyumiyat, the concept of Qayyumiyat in that Naqshbandis. Qayyumiyat. That point you have missed. You must see to it. So instead of Khilafat, instead of the succession, they are known as Qayyumiyat, and he appointed his son at Ajmer to get the blessings of Madin Chishti. There are some suggestions that you can take.
Jazakallah khair for that.
The point of a lecture is to encourage people to act, to get further, an inspiration, an encouragement, persuasion. The next step is to actually start learning seriously, to read books, to take on a subject of Islam and to understand all the subjects of Islam, at least at their basic level, so that we can become more aware of what our deen wants from us. And that's why we started Rayyan courses, so that you can actually take organized lectures on demand whenever you have free time, especially, for example, the Islamic Essentials course that we have on there, the Islamic Essentials Certificate, which you take 20 short modules, and at the end of that, inshallah, you will have gotten the basics of most of the most important topics in Islam, and you'll feel a lot more confident. You don't have to leave lectures behind. You can continue to leave, to listen to lectures, but you need to have this more sustained study as well. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.